Hello everyone, welcome back once again to this educational channel called Learn Bio with Janet. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 11, Subtopic 11.1 on Inheritance. I'm teaching this topic a bit early because it's usually put at the end of the syllabus and taught 1 or 2 months before SPM. So since it's a fairly new topic with challenging questions, I would like to teach it early so that you have time to digest the information and also understand the concepts and be able to draw the genetic diagrams and answer genetic questions. This is an interesting topic on how traits are passed down from parents to offspring. So let's get started. The learning standards for today's lesson are as follows. Subtopic 11.1, Monohybrid Inheritance. After this lesson, we should be able to describe the meaning of a monohybrid cross. Number 2, explain the monohybrid cross based on Mendel's experiments. Number 3, differentiate genetic terms related to inheritance, such as genes and alleles, characteristic and trait, phenotype and genotype, dominant allele and recessive allele, dominant trait and recessive trait, homozygote and heterozygote, pure breed and hybrid, parental generation and filial generation. Number 4, we should be able to construct monohybrid cross diagrams. Number 5, determine genotypic and phenotypic ratios of filial generations in a monohybrid cross. And number 6, describe Mendel's first law. So there are quite a lot of things that we are going to learn, and actually this subtopic will be divided into 2 videos. Okay, so all these terms will be mentioned in this video, but the definitions will be given in video number 2. Okay, so this subtopic will comprise 2 videos. So let's begin. Let us look at an overview of what we are going to study today. We will be discussing monohybrid inheritance, and we'll find out the meaning of the term monohybrid cross or monohybrid inheritance. So we will study one example of monohybrid cross, that is Mendel's experiment on the pea plant. So we'll discuss the procedure involved and his results. Next, we will try to explain his experiment, and we will be drawing a genetic diagram. So in the process, we will also be learning some terms. They are called terms related to inheritance or genetic terms, such as genes and alleles, characteristic and trait. What are the differences between these terms? Also, the phenotype and genotype, dominant allele and recessive allele, dominant trait, recessive trait, homozygote and heterozygote, pure breed and hybrid, parental generation and filial generation. So in this lesson, we will just use the examples from Mendel's experiment to explain these genetic terms. And the definition and more explanation will be given concerning these terms in the next video. So for today, we are going to study subtopic 11.1 on monohybrid inheritance. Firstly, what is the meaning of the term genetics? This term is constantly used, right? And we hear of it quite often. Genetics is actually a very interesting field of study in biology. And it is the study of heredity and variation of inherited characteristics. The term heredity means inheritance. It is a process whereby there's the passing down of traits or characteristics, sifat-sifat, from parents to offspring through the genes that are found in the gametes. The genes are the basic unit of inheritance. They are found in gametes. When the gametes undergo fertilization to form the new offspring, then the genes are passed down from the parents to the offspring. So heredity, also in Malay we call it pewarisan, and in Chinese it is 遗传. How about variation? what does variation mean? So variation means differences in characteristics between individuals of the same species, such as between humans. There are differences in height and blood group and eye color. For plants, there are differences in flower color, type of seed, and so forth. So all these are variation, okay? And then this is part of the study of genetics too. Now, who is Gregor Mendel? He's the first person who scientifically explained the principles of inheritance. He lived in the 19th century and he did a lot of experiments with his beloved pea plants. From there, he analyzed the results of his experiments and then proposed basic principles of inheritance of characteristics. So he's known as the father of modern genetics. Next, we have to understand the meaning of the term characteristic and differentiate it from the word trait. So a characteristic is a heritable feature such as height, eye color, blood group, and presence of dimples. Heritable means can be inherited, can be passed down. So it's a general feature like height, eye color. But when we state the word trait, it is more specific. So a trait is a variation or a variant of a specific characteristic. All right, let's look at some examples. So for the characteristic of height, tall stem or dwarf stem or short stem are the traits. Okay, so the traits describe a specific feature of the plant clearly. And for the characteristic of blood group, okay, blood group is a characteristic, but the traits are, so the traits are blood group A, so it's very specific. So a person may have blood group A or B or AB or O, all right, one of these. So that means the person has that particular trait. Say the person has the trait of blood group A, okay? So it's more specific than characteristic. And a trait is a variant of a specific characteristic. Let us do some exercises so that we can differentiate better between characteristic and trait. For the characteristic of height, there are two traits involved. A tall plant or tall stem and short plant or short stem for pea plants, all right? So these are traits. Now, can you tell me, if we describe the plant as having yellow seeds or green seeds, what is the characteristic that's involved? Yes, it's seed color, okay? Now, for flower color in pea plants, there are two colors, all right? So what are the two traits that are possible? Purple flower or white flower. For blood group in humans, there are 4 different traits. So a person can inherit 1 out of the 4 traits. Will inherit 1 trait. So a person can have blood group A, B, AB, or O. Lastly, for the trait, when we talk about the trait of black eyes or blue eyes or green eyes, actually what is the characteristic involved? Yes, eye color, all right? So when we say a person has curly hair, we're talking about her trait, for example, not characteristic. Let us find out some interesting things about Mendel's experiments. So Mendel studied how characteristics are inherited in the garden pea plants or Pisum sativum. That's the scientific name for the pea plant. He noticed that the pea plants possess several different characteristics with contrasting traits. For example, some pea plants are tall and some are dwarf or short. Some have white flowers while others have purple flowers. So this is the purple flower of the pea plant, and this one is the white flower. So some pea plants are tall and some pea plants are dwarf. Now Mendel crossed or mated pea plants with contrasting traits. For example, the tall pea plant was crossed with the dwarf pea plant. And then he counted the number of offsprings with the different traits. So what do we mean by a cross? Okay, crossing the pea plants. It means that we take the pollen grains from one plant and put it on the stigma of another plant, so that the male gametes from the first plant will fertilize the female gametes in the second plant, which has a contrasting trait to the first plant, right? So the seeds will be formed in the ovaries of in the flowers, and these seeds are the offsprings of the two plants which contributed the gametes. So he planted the seeds and then he counted the number of offsprings or the plants, the new plants with the different traits. Then he calculated the ratios of these offsprings. So in his conclusions, he said that a characteristic in a parent plant is passed down to its offspring through the male gametes. For example, male gametes in the pollen of the plant, pollen grains of the plant, and through the female gametes, which are the ova in the ovary of the plant. Now for humans, the male gamete is the sperm and the female gamete is the ovum. So actually what he said is correct, because now we know, for example, the nuclei or the nucleus of the sperm contains chromosomes. The nucleus of the ovum, which is the female gamete, contains chromosomes too, right? And these chromosomes carry the genes or genetic materials that determine the inherited characteristics of the organism, such as height and blood group for humans. So these genes are passed down from parents to offspring when for example, when the sperm fertilizes the ovum. Okay, so the nucleus of the sperm, which contains the genes, will fuse with the nucleus of the ovum, which also contains genes. So in that way, the zygote form has inherited the genes from the father, okay, through the sperm, and then from the mother through the ovum. So the genes are passed down from parents to offspring through the gametes, okay, and that's how traits are inherited. So the hereditary factor or inheritance factor, which Mendel mentioned, that determines a characteristic is what we call a gene today, okay? So what is a gene actually? Structurally, a gene is actually a segment of what? DNA, all right? In terms of structure, a gene is actually a segment of DNA that's found on a chromosome. Here are the 7 characteristics of the pea plant which was studied by Mendel. The first characteristic is the seed shape. Some pea plants have round seeds while others have constricted seeds. Constricted seeds are those seeds that are wrinkled a bit because of the seed coat. So they are not so round. In Malay we call it berkedut, okay? And then for seed color, some pea plants produce the yellow seeds and others produce green seeds. For pot shape, some pea plants produce the fruit or the pod that is inflated. It seems a bit swollen, and it seems like there's some air inside. So the outer covering is smoother a bit, and it is inflated or swollen. Now for the other one, the other type of pod shape is a constricted pod shape. Again, in Malay is called berkedut, right? And the pod, external surface of the pod looks a bit wrinkled up. Number 4, pod color. Some plants produce the green pods and some plants produce yellow pods. Flower color. Some plants have purple flowers while others have white flowers. For flower position, some plants produce flowers with the axial position. All right, axial position means that the flower grows up from the middle of the stem and not from the top of the stem. Okay, if it grows out from the top of the stem, it's called the terminal position of the flower. Lastly is the plant height. So some plants grow tall while others are dwarf. Dwarf means it's looks a bit stunted in height or short. So there are only two heights for the garden pea plant, either tall or dwarf. No intermediate heights. There are certain advantages in using pea plants to study inheritance. So Mendel chose the pea plant to study inheritance because it has many advantages compared to other organisms. Firstly, it can be easily grown. Secondly, it produces a lot of seeds or the offsprings, so that there is a large number of offsprings. There was a large number of offsprings for him to do his calculations on the ratios. That means the sample is big, all right? And so the calculations of the ratios will be more accurate, or were more accurate because of that, due to the big samples of offsprings. Now, pea plants also have both male and female reproductive structures, that is the stamens and the carpels. And it has a short generation interval, meaning a short lifespan or life cycle. So the lifespan is, or life cycle is, about 2 to 3 months. So that means that many generations of the pea plants can be grown in a short period of time for Mendel or other scientists to analyze. Finally, pea plants possess contrasting traits that are obvious and easy to identify. For example, the color of the pea pod is green or yellow. So these are very contrasting traits. Now, for the first learning standard, we are asked to describe the meaning of a monohybrid cross. So monohybrid inheritance or monohybrid cross involves the inheritance of only one characteristic that is controlled by a gene. Mono means one. Now, one characteristic usually consists of or has two different variations or variants, all right? Two contrasting traits. For example, if we are talking about inheritance of flower color in pea plant, the two contrasting traits are purple flower and white flower, okay? And that is controlled by one gene. For example, the gene for flower color, okay? Gene for flower color consists of two different forms or variants, and the two forms or variants of a gene are called alleles. We'll come to that again later. Then, be able to give one example of monohybrid inheritance. For example, the study of the inheritance of one characteristic such as height in pea plants by Mendel, okay, or color of the flower. So for height, to carry out a monohybrid cross, Mendel crossed, the word cross means to mate. So Mendel crossed or mated two plants with contrasting traits in height, okay, in height, which are a pure breed tall pea plant with a pure breed dwarf pea plant. Now this word pure breed, it is from the textbook, but if it's an adjective, it should be purebred pea plant, all right? But we go along with the textbook because it uses the word purebred. A purebred is a noun by itself, a purebred. So the adjective is purebred. Now let's find out how Mendel crossed or mated the two plants with contrasting traits in the next slide. Now, how do we carry out a cross between the tall plant and dwarf plant? What did Mendel do? All right. So to carry out a cross between a tall plant and dwarf plant, or two plants of contrasting traits, we must carry out cross-pollination between the tall plant and the dwarf plant. Meaning we take the pollen grains from the dwarf plant and put it on the stigma of the tall plant. All right. So before doing that, first of all, the anthers are removed from the tall plant. Okay, they are cut off. And this is to remove the pollen grains which contain the male gametes of the tall plant. This will prevent self-pollination, whereby the pollen grains or the male gametes from the tall plant are transferred to the stigma of the same plant, of the flowers of the same plant. All right, that will not be a cross between the tall plant and dwarf plant. So for a cross between tall plant and dwarf plant, the pollen grains must come from the dwarf plant. Okay, or it could be the other way around. Pollen grains come from plant A, but it's placed on the stigma of plant B. All right, but we take this case. Let the pollen grains come from dwarf plant B. So first of all, stamens with anthers are cut off from flower A of tall plant. Next, by using a brush or hand, Mendel used his hand, then the pollen grains are transferred from the anther of flower B here to the stigma of flower A, okay, of tall plant. So what happens next? The gametes, the male gametes from the pollen grains of dwarf plant of flower B will move down and fertilize the egg cells or ovum here in the ovule, which comes from the tall plant. Okay, so after fertilization, the seeds are formed, and these seeds are a product of the cross between tall plant and dwarf plant, in which the dwarf plant contributes the male gametes and the tall plant contributes the female gametes. So then the ovary in the tall plant A will mature to form a pod here, or a fruit. Then the seeds are removed from the pod and they are planted to produce offspring. Then the heights of the offspring are observed. Let us look at learning standard number 2. Explain a monohybrid cross based on Mendel's experiments. 10 marks. So Mendel carried out many monohybrid crosses where he studied the inheritance of just one characteristic, one at a time. And we are going to look at one of his experiments dealing with the inheritance of height in pea plants. So Mendel studied the inheritance of one characteristic, that is height in pea plants. And he crossed two plants with contrasting traits, or which have differences in height, which are a pure breed tall pea plant, or a purebred tall pea plant, or a true breeding tall pea plant, with a pure breed or purebred dwarf pea plant. So these two plants are the parental generation. So for pea plants, there are two different heights that are found in the pea plants, the tall pea plant and the dwarf pea plant. There are no intermediate heights like medium-sized pea plant and all that. Okay, so it's either tall or dwarf pea plant. The dwarf plant is shorter, of course, compared to the tall plant. So he crossed a pure breed tall plant. Now what do you mean by pure breed? It means that if these tall plants are crossed among themselves, that means if the pollen from one of these plants is placed on the stigma of the other plant and fertilization is allowed to occur, then the offspring produced, which are the produced from these two tall plants, will always be tall. Okay, that's why they're called pure breed or true breeding. They always produce the same type of plants as the parents themselves. Okay, so don't worry about that because we'll be talking more about pure breed later on. Now, so he artificially cross-pollinated the pure breed tall pea plant with the pure breed dwarf pea plant and then collected the seeds. Cross-pollinated means that he took the pollen from one of the plants. For example, he can take it from the dwarf pea plant and then he put it on the stigma of the flower of the tall pea plant. So fertilization will occur where gametes from the dwarf pea plant will fuse with the gametes from the tall pea plant. And then seeds are produced, and then he planted the seeds and then found out how the hybrid offspring looked like. Okay, so hybrid means mixed breed because this offspring is produced from two parents that are very different, the tall pea plant and the dwarf pea plant. So the offspring is called a mixed breed or hybrid. So we'll be discussing these terms later. So the hybrid offspring produced is called the first filial generation. They are the offspring of the parental generation. The results were that he observed all the offspring, which are the F1 generation, and they were all tall plants. So where is the where did the trait of dwarf plant go to? Or short stem, where did the trait go to? Did it disappear? So after that, Mendel crossed the F1 generation plants among themselves by self-pollination. So he took one F1 plant and he pollinated it with with the pollen from another F1 plant. All right, so that's called self-pollination. That means fertilization occurred between the gametes from two F1 plants. Then he collected the seeds produced and planted them to produce the second filial generation. So this is F2. So F2 is are the progeny or the offspring of F1. Okay, so what were the results of his experiment? The results were that for the F2 generation, dwarf plants did emerge, okay, did appear, and the ratio of the tall plants to the dwarf plants in the F2 generation was 3:1, around 3:1. If you approximate out, the ratio is around 3:1. So of course, he didn't just take 4 plants and planted them. He took thousands of the F2 generation plants and planted them till maturity, helped them to reach maturity, and then he counted how many were tall and how many were short. So this was his finding: 787 tall plants with 277 short plants. Okay, so if you round up the ratio of 787 is to 277, you'll get almost a ratio of you get this ratio of 3:1. So when he repeated these experiments again, he always came up with the same results. This diagram shows Mendel's experiment in picture form. Parents: purebred tall plant crossed with purebred dwarf plant. In the first filial generation, the F1 generation, all the offsprings produced are tall. Next, Mendel crossed the tall plants in the first filial generation among themselves. So the offspring of the first filial generation is the second filial generation, and there are, from all the plants that are produced, the ratio of the tall plants to the dwarf plant is 3 tall plants for every 1 dwarf plant, or 75% of the offspring are tall and 25% of the offspring are dwarf or short. So here's the interesting part. Mendel was able to explain the findings of his experiments and also explain why there was a 3:1 ratio for the F2 generation, all right, without having the knowledge of meiosis or of genes, because these concepts were not discovered yet during his time. So here we are going to also explain the findings of his experiments, all right, in a scientific way with the knowledge that we have now. So first of all, the characteristic of height in the pea plant is determined by the gene for height. So the height of the pea plant is a characteristic that can be inherited, and it is actually determined by the genes in the cells. The genes are the basic unit of inheritance, which are passed down from the parents to the offspring in the gametes. So there is a gene that determines the height of the plant, the pea plant, whether it's tall or dwarf. So we can say that the gene for height actually consists of 2 forms, or 2 variants, or 2 versions. All right. So the 2 forms or 2 variants or versions of a gene is called the allele. All right. So there is an allele or gene for tall stem, and we can use a letter big T to denote this allele. So allele is just a specific gene for a specific trait, like tall stem. Okay, from now on, I will use the word allele and not gene. But you know that it's sort of, it means a gene, a specific gene. All right, allele means a specific gene for a specific trait. Now, so the allele for tall stem will determine that the stem of the plant is tall, whereas the allele for dwarf stem causes the plant to be dwarf size. Okay, it controls the dwarf stem trait. Okay, the small t controls the dwarf stem trait, whereas big T controls the tall stem trait. So Mendel crossed two plants for the parental generation. So you're going to look at the cross of parental generation. He took a pure breeding tall plant and crossed it with a pure breeding dwarf plant. So the parental phenotype. What is the parental phenotype? Now the word phenotype means the observable trait or characteristic. So in this case, for the pure breed tall plant, we can observe that it is tall. And for the pure breed dwarf plant, the feature is that it is dwarf. How about the genotype? What do we mean by genotype? Genotype is the genetic composition in the cells. Meaning to say, what are the alleles that are found in each diploid cell? Okay, the genetic composition or the alleles that are found in each cell. So for the tall stem, for the tall plant, pure breed tall plant, it must have at least one allele for tall stem that determines that it is tall, right? So at least one big T. But actually there are two, because these alleles are carried by chromosomes, and in the diploid cell, this is inside a diploid cell, the chromosomes exist in pairs. There are two copies of each type of chromosome. Okay, so the two copies together form the pair of homologous chromosomes, as we have studied in chapter 6 of Form 4 syllabus. So this is how it looks like. For the tall plant, in each of its cells, it has one allele big T on the paternal chromosome. Let's say the pink one is the paternal chromosome, and another allele big T on the maternal chromosome. Okay, for this pair of homologous chromosomes that are of the same size and which carry the same type of genes. So pure breed here also means that there's only one type of allele, that is the big T allele. Pure, pure means there's only one type of this allele. And another way of calling it is homozygous dominant plant. Homozygous means having the same type of alleles. For example, big T allele. And then dominant, we'll come to this word later, right? Similarly, for the dwarf plant, it must have the allele for dwarf stem, which is small t, and there are two of it because homologous chromosomes carry these two alleles. A pair of homologous chromosomes will carry these two alleles, small t, small t. Okay, so each diploid cell contains two alleles for height. One from the male parent, the other is from the female parent of the plant here. Now, next, the process of meiosis occurs. So let's draw arrows pointing downwards, and what are the gametes produced? So the gametes produced will have only how many alleles inside them? Is it still two? No, because during meiosis, in anaphase 1, homologous chromosomes here will separate from each other and move to different poles. So they will take the alleles along with them, and at the end of meiosis, each daughter cell or gamete form has only one allele. Okay, so we can draw a circle to represent the gamete and separate these two alleles. So still we'll get only one type of gamete with the allele for tall stem, big T. So we just draw one to represent all the gametes which are the same, that contain the allele big T. Similarly, for the dwarf plant, the two alleles small t separate from each other during meiosis as the homologous chromosomes separate, and so every gamete of the dwarf plant will carry one allele small t. Next, the gametes fuse together during the process of fertilization to form the F1 generation. So F1 generation of first filial generation are the offspring of the parental generation. Now, what is the genotype of the F1 generation? So from here we can see that the gamete from the tall plant contains big T. Gamete from purebred dwarf plant contains small t allele. So when they fuse together, these two cells fuse together, we get a zygote and the offspring that contains this allele big T and this allele small t together. Okay? So all the F1 plants have the same genotype or genetic composition, which is big T, small t, the genotype. So what is the phenotype of the F1 plants? Phenotype means the observable characteristic. Is it tall or dwarf? Okay, as was seen in Mendel's experiment, as was observed, all the plants were tall. Okay, so how did Mendel explain that? Well, he said that the allele for tall stem is dominant compared to the. So what's the definition for a dominant allele? A dominant allele, such as big T or the allele for tall stem, is an allele that is able to express its trait or show its trait, even if it's in the same cell together with the recessive allele, small t. So when you think of the word dominant allele, think of the word stronger allele or stronger gene within inverted commas. Okay, and the word recessive is has the rough meaning of being the weaker allele. All right. So what happens is that the dominant allele big T, which is the allele for tall stem, will express its trait or show its trait in the plant. So all the plants will be tall. And secondly, it will suppress, on Malay we say menindas, or cover or mask the effect of the recessive allele. So this recessive allele, small t, which is the allele for dwarf stem, is not able to express its trait in the plant. Okay, so that's why all the plants are tall, because the recessive allele cannot express its trait at all, as it is suppressed. Its effect is suppressed by the dominant allele. So only the dominant allele will express its trait or show its trait. So all the plants are tall. Now the tall plants are also called hybrid plants because they have one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Hybrid means like mixed breed. Okay, so it's no longer pure breed because it has two different alleles, one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Okay, as compared to the pure breed plant, which has only one type of allele, either big T or small t. Okay, so big T small t plant is a hybrid. The plant that has the genotype big T small t is a hybrid plant, mixed breed. Now let's go on to the second part of Mendel's experiment, where he self-crossed the F1 generation plants. So the F1 phenotype, as we have seen the last slide, is that they are all tall and they have the genotype or genetic composition of big T, small t. All right, and we said they are hybrid plants. So another word for hybrid plant is heterozygous plant or a heterozygote. Okay, so heterozygous is an adjective, so you must put the word plant or organism at the back. Heterozygous plant or organism. When we say heterozygote, goat is a noun. So it means the same thing in that in a heterozygote, goat or hybrid, the two alleles on the same loci or locus, on the same position here, on a pair of homologous chromosomes here, are different. One allele is a dominant allele contributed by one parent, and the other allele is a recessive allele contributed by the other parent. All right, so when the two alleles are different, and we can easily know that if we see that there's one capital letter and one small letter. Okay, because the capital letter represents the dominant allele and the small letters, small t, represent the recessive allele that controls the same characteristic. Okay, so another example is big B, small b. Big B is a dominant allele that controls a particular, that determines a particular trait, and then the small b is the recessive allele. So this organism, an organism with this genotype, is a heterozygote or a hybrid. Next is meiosis. Okay, so for meiosis we draw arrows. Now we have to draw two arrows because the gametes formed. For the gametes formed, there are two types of gametes formed from each organism. The same principle applies as earlier. In meiosis, homologous chromosomes separate from one another, and they will cause the alleles to separate from one another and move to different poles and into different cells. So the first gamete will have the allele big T, and the second gamete will have the allele small t. Okay, the first type of gamete has allele big T, the second type of gamete has allele small t. Similarly for this plant too. It does not mean that there are only two gametes, but rather that 50% of the gametes have allele big T. 50% of the gametes have allele small t for this plant. Okay, but we write only two to represent the gametes that are the same. All gametes that are the same, that have big T, and all gametes that have small t. Next is the process of fertilization, and then the formation of F2 generation. The second filial generation is the F2 generation, which is the offspring of the first filial generation, or F1 generation. Now, what are the different combinations of gametes that we can have here? So previously we have only one gamete from each plant for the parental cross. But here now you have two gametes each from each parent plant. So you can have a few possibilities. The first gamete from the first plant can fuse with the first gamete from the second plant. So draw lines that meet to show the fusion, like this. And then write your genotype under the first gamete to make it neat. Big T with big T. So these two alleles will come together in the zygote and in the organism that's formed. So the first organism or first offspring of F1 generation has the genotype big T, big T. Second possibility is that the first gamete can fuse with the second gamete from the other plant. So draw lines, not arrows. Don't draw arrows here. Okay, draw lines that merge or meet together here, and we can combine the two alleles together in the same cell. Big T, small t. Now the third possibility is for the second gamete. Second gamete from first plant can fuse with the first gamete from second plant. So small t, big T, but always write the capital letter first. So big T, small t. Same like this one. Last combination is second gamete with second gamete from the other plant. Small t, small t. Okay. From there we get from the genotype we get the phenotype. So if you look at all these three plants, they have the big T allele for tall stem, which is dominant. This allele is dominant. So all these three plants will be tall. So right here, tree tall. Now the last plant here, the last organism here, or genotype here, it has two recessive alleles. Okay, so there is no dominant allele big T, thus it cannot be tall. The tall trait cannot mask or suppress the effect of the tall allele or the big T allele does not mask or suppress the effect of the recessive allele small t. So small t is able to express its trait. Okay, this allele is able to express its trait, which is dwarf stem. So one dwarf. Next, we have to be able to write down the genotypic and phenotypic ratio. What do you mean by that? Now for genotypic ratio, look at all these genotypes and group them together into three types. Okay, for monohybrid inheritance, there are only three possible genotypes, and each genotype will have two alleles in it. So the first one is one big T, and then for big T small t there are two. This is the hybrid plant, and then small t there's one. Okay, in other words, there's one homozygous dominant plant is to two heterozygous plant is to one homozygous recessive plant. Okay, and the phenotypic ratio is the ratio of the observable characteristics or trait. So it's 3 tall is to 1 dwarf. Okay. So for this type of cross where two heterozygous plants or hybrid plants are crossed, you always get a ratio of 3:1 for the phenotypic ratio. This is one of the rules that you can try to take note of. If two heterozygous plants, big T, small t, are crossed, you will get the ratio of 3 with the dominant trait to 1 with the recessive trait for the phenotypic ratio. Okay, now it's your turn to draw the diagram. So you can screenshot the previous diagram for the cross of parental of the parents, the cross of the parents, and then also this one, and you can draw the diagram. This is called a genetic or schematic diagram, which can be asked in the exam. So the rules are all the titles must be on your left hand side, and this dotted line is just an imaginary line actually. Actually, you don't have to have it there. And here we write all the titles in the right sequence, and your content must match with the titles. So if you write F1 genotype, big T, small t must be on the same horizontal line as this one, as the title. Cannot have one of it slope down, come down, one line down from it. Okay, or for gametes, all these circles must be on the same horizontal line, same as the title gametes. Even these arrows, these points here, they must be at the same level. And then F2 genotype must be this one. Don't write the F2 genotype further down under phenotype. That will be wrong. So the marking will go this way. F2 genotype, then they will check to see whether all the genotypes are there. They give you a tick at there. For gametes, they will look at all the circles here. It must be on the same line. If one of your gametes is at the low level, then it's not considered anymore. Because it doesn't match with the title. The position is not matching with the titles. Okay? And draw neat diagrams with neat letters that are clear so that the examiner can know what letter it is. So it must be neat and good. And also the F2 genotype here must be written right below the gametes to make it neat. Okay? Each genotype is written below a gamete. Okay, that's all for the drawing. So practice drawing, because for genetic diagrams, you have to practice drawing to be good in it. Practice makes perfect. Okay? And we'll look at some genetic problems or questions later on. Very interesting genetic questions. Here are the notes for what we have discussed just now, the complete notes. I will not be going through this again, as it is the same as what I've discussed. But the important point here is you must be able to explain what happens during meiosis and fertilization for essay questions or structured questions. Like during the formation of gametes in meiosis, homologous chromosomes separate and move to opposite poles in anaphase 1. Thus, gametes will only carry one allele for height. Each gamete will only carry one allele for height. And then you have to mention the gamete carries what allele, either allele big T or small t. And then in fertilization, you must be able to mention that the gametes will fuse together. So maybe a gamete which carries allele big T fuses with a gamete which carries allele small t to produce a offspring with what genotype, like genotype big T, small t in the first filial generation. All right, so these notes, and also the last part is you have to be able to explain that if one allele is dominant, it will be able to express its trait in the tall plant. So if allele big T is dominant, the genotype big T, small t expresses only the dominant trait of phenotype, that is tall stem. The effect of the recessive allele small t is suppressed. This is one of the things that you can write down. Or mask. Suppress or mask, that means it's covered and it cannot express its trait. Okay, the recessive allele will not be able to express its trait in the organism. Okay, when it's in the presence of the dominant allele big T. So this is a continuation of the inheritance of height in pea plant. Its explanation for the cross between two F1 plants. Okay, so again, meiosis and random fertilization. Make sure you know how to explain it. I will be coming back to this in the next video to give you some problems, some genetic problems to try, and then you can practice writing out all these. So here I just point out to you. Now, if a gamete with allele big T fuses with a gamete which carries allele big T too, then a homozygous dominant offspring with genotype big T is produced, and its phenotype or observable characteristic is tall stem. But if a gamete with allele big T fuses with a gamete with allele small t, then a heterozygous individual will be formed with genotype big T small t. And the phenotype of this type of plant is tall stem, because the allele for tall stem is dominant to the allele for dwarf stem. And lastly, if a gamete with allele small t fuses with another gamete with allele small t, a homozygous recessive individual is formed, and the phenotype is dwarf or short stem. Now, for monohybrid inheritance, when one characteristic is studied, there are 3 different individuals or plants with 3 different genotypes that can be produced. All right. So the individual can either be, or the organism can either be heterozygous, homozygous dominant, or homozygous recessive. So here we have 3 cells from 3 different organisms. If you look at the first cell here, this individual or organism is described as heterozygous, homozygous dominant, or homozygous recessive. So look carefully at the alleles. Okay, so since it has 2 big T alleles, 2 alleles, big T, it is a homozygous dominant organism, which is, sometimes we use the word purebred or pure breed or true breeding. Secondly, how about this organism which has this type of cells? So if you look at the alleles, it's big T small t, thus it is a heterozygous individual or a hybrid or a mixed breed, because there's one dominant allele big T and one recessive allele small t. Now, third one is homozygous recessive individual. It's still a pure breed, or it's a purebred organism, and it is true breeding. Let us look at an acronym to help us remember the titles on the left side of our genetic diagram, such as cross of parental generation, parental phenotype, parental genotype, meiosis, gametes, and so forth. So the acronym is, to remember the first letters of all these words. Cross, you must remember the C and then the P and the G here. Okay, parental phenotype, you must remember there are 2 P's here. So the acronym is, come on Prince George, pardon parrot, and please get me Galaxy, this handphone, for finding gems for princess. Okay, so the come on Prince George, it has these letters C, the first letters are C, O, P, G. So it stands for cross of parental generation. All right, you just remember the first letters of this acronym to help you remember the titles. So this acronym comes with a story. Maybe there's a parrot who stole the gems or jewels from the princess, and you found it. So you asked Prince George for a reward, which is a Galaxy phone. And then you ask Prince George to pardon the parrot. Pardon parrot. Okay, so parental phenotype. So pardon, the P here, and parrot, P here. So PP stands for parental phenotype. PG stands for parental genotype, and so forth. Now for me, the M stands for meiosis. The ME stands for meiosis. G, the G in Galaxy stands for gametes. And then for the F stands for fertilization. Finding gems, FG stands for F1 genotype, and then FP for princess, FP stands for F1 phenotype. All right, so you have to repeat this sentence a few times. All right, or some over a period of time for you to remember the acronym, then it'll be quite easy for you to write down the titles, right? For the first part, with the cross of parental generation, all that. Now for the schematic diagram, there's a simpler list of titles used in the genetic diagram in the later part of the chapter 11 of the textbook. Okay, so they use these titles: parents followed by phenotype, genotype. So here they no longer write parental phenotype because it's understood this phenotype is for parents. Okay, then after that you have the process of meiosis, and then the formation of gametes, and then gametes undergo fertilization. Then you have genotype of F1 or child or offspring. Offspring meaning the progeny also, all right, or progeny. Phenotype of F1, child or offspring. So maybe this one can be used later on in the drawing of genetic diagrams. Now here the acronym is Papa, please get me galaxy for growing fruits plus flowers. Okay, so the first letter, take the first letter of all these words for the acronym, in the acronym, to represent the first letters of the titles. Okay, right, that's all for this lesson. I hope that you have learned something from this video, and thanks for watching. Do share, like and subscribe. Till we meet again, goodbye. And in the second video, I'll be discussing the genetic terms with the definitions. I will also be giving you more genetic questions to try, which are very interesting.